Welcome to the virtual Mariana Kistler Beach Museum of Art. My name is Eileen June Wang. I am a curator here at the museum, and our guest speaker is distinguished scholar and artist, Dr. Deborah Willis, who will present her latest research on Gordon Parks. After Professor Willis presents her research, I will moderate a conversation with her. Audience, please join in by typing your questions in the chat section, and I will pose your question to Dr. Willis. The program is related to the exhibition currently on display at the museum, Gordon Parks, Homeward to the Prairie Icon, co-curated by Museum Registrar Sarah Price and me, and its partner exhibition, Doug Barrett, Find Your Voice, curated by me as well. Watch out for the virtual versions of these exhibitions in a couple of weeks on the museum's website. For this program, closed captioning is available. Click on the CC icon at the bottom of your screen or at the top right-hand corner. This program is being recorded, and the video will be posted on the museum's YouTube channel, and a transcript will be made available with the recording. For the benefit of audience members who are primarily listening, I will offer brief descriptions of what we are discussing whenever possible. Before we get to the program, I want to acknowledge first that K-State, as the first land grant institution established under the 1862 Morrill Act, is historically home to many Native nations, including the Kaw, Osage, and Pawnee. Furthermore, Kansas is the current home to 4 federally recognized Native nations: the Prairie Band Potawatomi, the Kickapoo Tribe of Kansas, the Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, and Sac and Fox Nation of Missouri in Kansas and Nebraska. Many Native nations utilize the Western Plains of Kansas as their hunting grounds, and others, such as the Delaware, were moved through this region during Indian removal efforts to make way for white settlers. K-State and every university in the US is on indigenous land. The recognition that America's history begins and continues through indigenous contexts is essential to the mission of this museum, which seeks to create decolonized spaces at the university and increase the presence, promotion, and support of indigenous and other traditionally marginalized faculty, staff, and students at K-State. And now, I'm honored to introduce you all to Dr. Deborah Willis, who is University Professor and Chair of the Department of Photography and Imaging at the Tisch School of the Arts at New York University. She teaches courses on photography and imaging, iconicity, and cultural histories, visualizing the Black body, women, and gender. She directs NYU's Center for Black Visual Culture, Institute for African American Affairs. Dr. Willis has been making significant contributions to African American history and culture from her first book in 1985, Black Photographers, 1840 to 1940, an illustrated bio-bibliography, to her book, Reflections in Black, A History of Black Photographers, 1840 to the Present, to her book published earlier this year, The Black Civil War Soldier, A Visual History of Conflict and Citizenship. Professor Willis is a well-regarded scholar of Gordon Parks, with essays in such publications as the definitive catalog raisonné, Gordon Parks Collected Works, and the exhibition catalog published by the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. in 2018. Professor Willis also worked with Gordon Parks, along with curator Philip Brookman, on Parks's major retrospective at the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. in 1997. What's even more amazing is that Professor Willis has also contributed to American history and culture through art. She had a solo exhibition entitled Framing Beauty at the International Vision Center in Washington, D.C. in 2013, which explored through photography how contemporary African Americans constructed their identities and images. She also exhibited with her son, renowned artist Hank Willis Thomas, in a collaborative exhibition entitled Progeny at the Art Gallery of Columbia University in 2009. In 2019, her images were displayed on large banners on the National Hotel in Miami, Florida, during the Contemporary Art Fair, Art Basel. As you can see, I'm fangirling here. Everyone, let's please give a warm welcome to Dr. Deborah Willis. Dr. Willis, take it away.
Thank you, Eileen, and thank you, Jennifer, for inviting me, and the captioners for being a part of this discussion. I'm excited to share another vision of Gordon Parks and stories about Gordon in different ways, just to think about the experience of Gordon through home. I have not written about it as much as I'd like, but I've been thinking about it for a long time based on Gordon's kitchen table photographs. And so I was really excited when you, Eileen, invited me to think about a project and talk about Gordon's work when I was in Kansas, basically almost a year and a half ago or more, or so. So it's really important. But as we all know, Gordon was born in 1912, and he received the Rosenwald Fellowship, $2,100 to work on a project in Washington, D.C. And he wrote in his application to spend 1 year portraying the Negro in his intellectual, professional, educational, farm, and urban life. And he was 30 years of age during that time. But to think about, he had a commitment to social documentary photography, and he wanted to tell a story. I was influenced by Gordon's work as an undergraduate student, but also as a preteen. I grew up in my mom's beauty shop and used to look at magazines, and knew that at one point in my life, I wanted to become a photographer, and based on the fact of Gordon's work, but also the effect that Gordon had on a number of photographers. I want to start off with sharing my screen and begin with the first slide. You can hear me now, correct?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I thought I wanted to introduce Gordon with the camera, again, behind my backdrop, but also with this image here. Also, that growing up in my family house, as I mentioned earlier, I grew up in a house in North Philadelphia. This is the family home. Some years later, and growing up in a home where family's central, the experience of family from the kitchen table, as I mentioned earlier, but to think about how Gordon used that experience of mothers and daughters, children and family, playing, and then also the black doll, the white doll experience that Gordon shared in his projects. The experience of wallpaper and what happens in these family environments. These are photographs that my father took, the two earlier photographs, but this is a photograph that I took when I received my first camera when I was probably about 7 or 8 years old. And I photographed my doll, my black doll, whose name was Susie. And here under the Christmas tree, and Christmas was really central for us, as we love to share in pictures. You can see the mantle full of cards. The TV is a central place. But going back to this image here of my father photographing me at the table, my mother looking adoringly at me, but the placement of the table, but the wallpaper. And I really found this really fascinating, that my father, when I looked at this photograph, I thought my father was, of course, documenting my sister and I and our dolls. And he also worked as a paper hanger. He was a policeman in the city of Philadelphia, but he also had a business as a paper hanger. But I didn't know that he was photographing his handicraft for calendar images. So I found it fascinating to connect my story to Gordon's story, but also going through the notion of home. And this is a photograph I made in New Orleans in 2013, looking at how families in New Orleans documented and created a space for home. Because I think that home is about memory and preserving memory, but also what do we preserve in telling the story about family and home. And when we think about Gordon and the cameras that he used, from a large format camera to a 35mm camera, that the projects that he exposed the world to, is critically focused because of his camera, the choice of the camera and how the images were archived. Lighting was central. This is a photograph by Morgan and Marvin Smith, who were twin brother photographers from Kentucky, photographing Gordon in Harlem in 1946. Let's begin to think about Gordon in Fort Scott, Kansas. It's central for me to connect home and what does home look like to Gordon. Home with family members and friends. Here, Gordon is in the forefront of this family photograph, but also another image of Gordon on the right. So we see a dapper Gordon early on. We see Gordon as conscious of his image as a Black man, teenager in a segregated town. Style was important, dress was important, and friendship was important for him. When we think about Gordon as he began to expand his life with his family in Paris, to document his wife driving the car and his 3 children in a convertible as they pass through the Arc de Triomphe in terms of the iconic image of Paris. And Gordon understanding home for his family, a new place in Paris, but also to central way of looking at home. And here we begin to see the celebration of home with balloons and the 3 children and his wife, Sally, first wife, Sally, in the car. Other images in other collections, such as the Chicago Public Library. There's a self-portrait of Gordon in 41. And then, but style, again, you see he has a cuff on his wrists. He has a vest sweater under, and he's looking directly into the camera. He's presenting an image. This is the time of the foundation when he received the Rosenwald Fellowship. And here is the other image of Gordon coming out of the Harlem Y on 135th Street, photographed by Cecil Lane. And he has his equipment with him, and he's about to go in on an assignment. You can see his trench coat, and you can see the excitement of Gordon, a photographer who believed in telling a story, believed in his home story. And in 1950, he went back to Kansas to photograph in Fort Scott. But also in the 60s and 70s, he began writing a book called The Learning Tree. And he also filmed The Learning Tree in Kansas. And this is a still from the experience of the set with the young man who played his role, and they're in a battle. And Gordon is directing this scene, and we can see the lighting. But so Gordon understood the importance of home, but also understood the importance of what it meant for him as a photographer to think about his memoir, but also to think about as a Black man growing up, Black boy, Black man, young man growing up in the Midwest and creating a film. So one of the first Black film productions of this time. Okay, so it's not moving forward. Here is a photograph of the railroad station in Fort Scott, Kansas in 1950. We see trains, we see the dark clouds, we see the experience that we all know from movies about Kansas and the clouds. And the clouds could be inviting or fearful in a sense. But we see this darkness at the end of the day, and the way that this photograph is created, that Gordon is able to reimagine leaving this town and what it meant to leave this town at this time of day. And we began to think about ways to imagine Gordon's life in this town with Sarah Parks, his mother. I find it fascinating that Gordon had this image still in his archive. Photograph of his mother made by the Dabbs photographic studio. Image that looks about at the 1890s. It's a cabinet card. She is, his mother is dressed in, and it's in the studio, but we see a wonderful dress from the period. Her hair is styled. She's beautifully posed, leaning on a chaise lounge, the edge of a chaise. But we see carpet. We see the photographer's backdrop. But looking at this image and understanding beauty, the way that Gordon Parks preserved beauty, began to think about the importance of home for Gordon based on this photograph that he preserved and kept of his mother. Photographing in the town, the pool hall. This is in 1950. Here we see young men, older men, and the pet. So it's really fascinating to think about Gordon and framing a community. Just standing outside the window and looking in, looking at the style of the hats. A family portrait in 1950, where we see 4 young children and a couple. Lighting, I mean, he's using the experience of natural light. So when we think about his framing of natural light to artificial light to tell the story, but we see the handicraft of the mother who definitely made the dresses of the children. So he begins to see a story of life in this city through this family. We, the porches, the interiors, and also to the deathbed of a family, of a woman who's dying, an elderly woman who's dying in Fort Scott. We see the wallpaper. We see the last rites in terms of that exchange. This is a woman who undoubtedly survived slavery. And we see this experience of another elderly woman in conversation with a woman, possibly in prayer. We also see at the edge of the image a hand of a man, possibly a preacher or a family member, standing by in this stance of watching and waiting for the death of this elderly woman. In Gordon also, the weight, as we see the stories, women in glasses, women in wearing aprons, women wearing house dresses. But the window, when we see Gordon facing the experience of family, as we consider the importance of home. And here we can see the well-kept home through the wallpaper. Also education and travel, and the whole notion of migration. And here is a photograph of young people outside of a building, the suitcase, the white dress, the white shoes. So we begin to see how he's looking at places where young people are meeting and having conversations. And I'm not sure why it's not, okay, here. And then I'm going into Chicago now. And as I mentioned earlier about the experience of the calendar image, that Gordon also made calendar images. And this is a photograph of his first wife, Sally, with his daughter, Tony. And he used these images and sold calendars with photographs and to create a sense of art for the family, art for the everyday, calendar images, family of the month. And here we see this very touching nighttime image as Sally prepares Tony for bedtime, and the way that it's posed. She's wearing yellow. The baby Tony is wearing has a pink wrap around her head. But there's a tender moment that Gordon is creating. We don't see a wallpaper, but we see a gray backdrop. But the way that the lighting is in the back kind of creates a sense of warmth in this image. And again, Sally also made hats and was an artist, was also interested in fashion. And Gordon worked as a photographer and also artistic director for a magazine called Circuit Smart Women. And this is the Christmas issue. So he, in terms of creating the ideal image of Sally, who's wearing a hat that she actually made, and a hood, a jacket, and just imagining Black women receiving this magazine and having an opportunity to consider ways to share Christmas presents and traveling through the city of Chicago. And here Gordon is photographing in 3 different locations with different types of packages for Christmas gifts, and the hats, as we see here. We see family members, which includes the Vaughn family and Valerie Jarrett, who was a young teenager at the time in 1941. We see Marva Lewis, who was a close friend of Gordon's, but also Joe Lewis's wife. And Gordon, one of the images that Gordon was always interested in fashion and fashion photography. And he invited Marva to pose, and then he also had an opportunity to meet other women in the Chicago area to photograph. And we see the work of women in the 1940s, the fashion, the models, the women who were writers, and so Gordon is photographing them. But the backdrop of this, the silhouette, the portrait, we see the shadow, and the way that he has this artistic way of the way the netting of the hat is framed on the wall, and the way that he's able to enhance the beauty of this image through lighting and the shadow. Another image in a tenement in Chicago. We know that it's a hot day, and I'm going to try to remove my image so you can see the full frame. And here it's a hot day. There's a woman seated at the window looking out. There's a man smoking on the bed. And then there are other people on the other image just sitting around looking out the window, just reimagining their lives, difficult times in their lives. A young boy playing with a sheet around his neck as if he is Superman. So he has wings and he has a cape. So he's imagining the whole aspect of, reading comic books and reading and kind of playfulness. And this is titled Ghetto Boy 1953. But he just thinking about this experience and how children play. Gordon is documenting it from the experience of a man seated in a bar or luncheonette at the end of a day before going home. And the central point for this, for me, I see a man in transition and focusing on a moment. Gordon is also looking at families outside of their homes in Washington, D.C. on 7th Street, a young man standing outside of a shoe shop in the DC area, in the Northwest area. And here, again, as I mentioned earlier, why I was so attracted to this invitation to think about home, he photographed the Frederick Douglass housing project in Washington, D.C. Here, a family says grace before their evening meal in 1942. A full table, from the bread, a stack of white bread, the chicken, the vegetables, and the mashed potatoes. The young baby seated in the high chair. Gordon is able to capture it all. The window, as the mother looks through and creates a decoration throughout. And so the experience about family and home, the central part of this story. And this is in Anacostia area of Washington, D.C., as she teaches her young daughter how to wash her hands. The images of a church in the DC area. But here's another one of the mother who is in this public housing, but also looking out the window as she prepares a meal, chopping potatoes, but also looking at her young children playing. So the mother is constantly looking. Gordon is also looking through over her shoulder, creating a sense of protection as he makes this image. But we also see the beauty of the home, the way that she has stylized her curtains. And Gordon is enhancing that with the doily on the table. We see the wood table. And in terms of the contrast of how do we think about the tenement houses in Washington, in Connecticut, and here this experience of the heat. We see the summer. We see this is 1949. We see the houses, the young people seated on the porch. And this image here of a young girl who lives near the Capitol in 1942, looking very uneasy as she poses for the photographer. And the photographer is looking into these homes in Southeast Washington. And these are, many of these homes were destroyed for large government buildings that we see now in Washington. So here is 122 C Street. This is the back of it. And then Gordon is able to photograph the decay, but also the beauty of how people are preserving what they have, what little they have in this image. The way, again, as I mentioned, play, he understands children in play, recreation, their children playing marbles. We also see work in the backdrop where a family's clothesline is hanging. And so we begin to see, even though these people are living in a difficult situation of poverty, that presentation was important for them. Looking over a screen to a family here in Puerto Rico of a man holding his young granddaughter as they look at a parade for an election. And again, the way the Gordon is photographing, he is looking up and kind of lionizing, creating and elevating the grandfather, elevating this moment. And then looking directly into a family member in church. So he's at the eye level of a grandmother with her grandchild at church. And we see the hat, we see the men in the backdrop at church, in the church pews, but we see another woman with a hat tilted to the side. So we see again that Gordon is looking at women, style, men and style, and men who, in terms of dress and respectability. And this is what he's looking through. And this is at the Church of God in Christ in Washington, D.C. in 1942. This is the church, also the St. Martin Spiritual Church, where Ella Watson was a parishioner. And we see here two ushers and another experience in New Britain, Connecticut, a child care center. in 1942, where mothers who had to go to work, leaving their children for care. And this is many women during the war industry work, Black and white women, Latino women, and Asian women all worked in this Northeast area to create uniforms for soldiers. But then Gordon is documenting the curtains as these children play house and they create their own curtains with their dolls and the experience of family. This is a photograph of Ella Watson at her altar in her bedroom as she looks out the window, but we also see that Gordon is photographing. We see the Christ image again on the wall. We see a ceramic Christ on the table, on the bureau top, but candles and the mirror. And the mirror is a central figure for Gordon, as we know that we're not only reflecting beauty, but documenting beauty and holding on to beauty. Images of Ella Watson's grandchildren, the holding the white doll. To the image here, that Ella Watson, who raised her 3 grandchildren and her adopted daughter. But the way that Gordon photographs this is it's just wonderful, where he begins to create ancestry, where we see the generations. This is Ella Watson's family, mother, parents, photograph in the front. And then we see this image of the reflection of the image of the daughter seated on the bed. Gordon is able to create 4 frames in this image. And as we begin to go inside the bedroom, outside into the kitchen, and then outside in the area of the home. And we see a woman who who leaves for her office at 4 a.m. to take care, clean up the offices in the government, but then coming back to take care of her 3 grandchildren, and creating this image in 1942 with the American flag in the back, which he entitled it American Gothic, holding the American flag, as a backdrop, framing the history of labor with a mop and a broom, and the dress, and the polka dotted dress pinned on Mrs. Watson. Here at the end of the day, a very spiritual woman, as I mentioned before, calendar images that he sees on the wall, he documents. He also documents the Christ figure that's across over her bed and the children in bed as she waits for them to fall asleep. Another image in Washington, D.C., that a favorite of mine, the round mirror on the bureau, of a photograph of Franklin Delano Roosevelt pinned to the wall, of a woman who definitely finds him a special man in 1942. But we see that Gordon is photographing the mirror, and then behind the mirror, we see another dresser with photographs. So we begin to see the importance of how art is displayed in some of these homes, some of the homes that have a sense of, designed for beauty, but even if they're uncomfortable in the way that they're living. And that's something to think about looking at these works. He photographed a pregnant woman in Puerto Rico, families in Puerto Rico, and in Harlem. This is Red walking home at the end of the day after Gordon and Red have an interview about his life and the experiences that he'd had over time. Wonderful way of documenting a young man, teenager, who's lost, but looking for a change in his life outside of the violence of gangs, and the way that he's dressed in the suit, and the way that Gordon says goodbye to him in this image as he walks through a lonely street, St. Nicholas Avenue, and the high-rise apartments on the left and right of the image. it's about solitude. It's a beautiful image as Gordon photographs him from the ground up. Another favorite Harlem image of mine is a woman and dog in the window. Just imagine a woman coming home from work and spending time with her dog. And pets, I see, are essential for Gordon, and looking at the way that he is documenting this dog who's looking also with his owner and at the window and what's going on in the streets of Harlem. This is Red with his girlfriend hugging, to Red reading a magazine at home. And then after a rival gang kills a friend of Red, Jackson, he's looking over the window. This is one of Gordon's iconic images. And an important image is Harlem rooftops, as we see the experience of Harlem in 1948 through the lens of Gordon and the experience of Ralph Ellison. And here are contact sheets of Gordon photographing Ralph Ellison in Harlem, and before the project Invisible Man is published. And these are just wonderful ways of looking at a writer about the experience, about being invisible in a city such as New York City. Untitled image in Harlem, hot summer day, young girls lined against the wall, children are running through the fire hydrants in this image. But Gordon centers his camera on a young man with his shirt open, looking back, riding his bike, and the way that he's photographed. He creates a beautiful moment to understand that these are hot days in Harlem, but these are young children who often don't have an opportunity to play in public recreation centers because of segregation or because of lack of play instruments for them or opportunities for them to swim in swimming pools. And that was a central place for Harlem. This is a project he published in Ebony magazine, and it was about, as it was titled, Problem Kids. He also photographed the psychologists, Mamie and Kenneth Clark, who asked the child, give me the doll, it's the black doll, the white doll, what's the doll that you like the best? What is the pretty doll? Asking the questions when they begin to see how children desire black or white dolls or deny a black doll. And this is experience that he is photographing in a Harlem office. The child is conflicted as he picks the white doll, but looking at the black doll in terms of identity. Photographing homelessness in a man who's sleeping on the streets in Harlem. To the Fontanelles. He spent a week in the home of the Fontanelles and in their Harlem tenement, and he writes about them. There's a book about this family. He tries to, he buys them food. He spends a week with them without a camera, and then he comes back and returns with his camera to photograph. And here, Bessie is cleaning the tub as she prepares after washed clothes for their children. She also creates this image, and this is one of the images that I love. This was published, it was photographed in 1968, but published in 1969, and a dress for her daughter, Ellen. And the way that this dress is ironed, and it's hanging on the side of the bed. And I believe that Gordon understood that this was Bessie armor, this is her armor, Ellen's armor, as she prepares and irons the dress, so that at least her children's clothes are clean and ironed and they're prepared to go to school. And so in terms of this socialization that Gordon is able to document, to see even through the difficult and looking at the debris throughout the home, that finding this opportunity to photograph this dress just hanging on the side says a lot about humanity in that home. And these are images of Bessie returning home from work, cooking, as we all see again, the image of the Christ. Photographing in a Muslim family in prayer. And then I decided to just kind of break up these images as we look at ways of cities and homes. As I showed in the early image in Fort Scott, this young man has a flat tire, and these are other people helping. A family here in Columbus, Ohio, their home, but their car, cars were central. We see this car as focused, as a sense of upward mobility. We see a woman playing pool in Detroit, and the men looking and guiding where she should push the ball, the 8-ball ahead. It's just a really joyful moment as Gordon is part of this. So we feel as a viewer that we are part of this scene. Also photographing Duke Ellington at the Hurricane Club in 1943. Fashion, again, as Gordon photographs from behind, we see below, we see Duke Ellington's silk socks, but also he photographs Ellington's ties. And we know in terms of style and fashion. In 1960, he photographs Duke Ellington again as he's at the piano. And so when thinking about Gordon and the way that he travels through different cities, looking for beauty and documenting beauty, two women seated at a Coca-Cola root beer fountain, and a young man looks standing behind. And so we began to see what Gordon is looking at as he thinks about community and thinks about ways that family could share a table and share a table in a public restaurant. Another image here of a family, a farm family in Somerville, Maine. And this is the Hercules Brown family. And here again, Gordon is documenting a baby being fed to an older man and children and wives. And here Gordon also becomes a part of the family in the family photograph, documenting this moment. And he's at ease and sharing this story. And again, thinking about connecting Ella Watson to the foreground and middle ground and background of images that Gordon documents. Foreground, we see the older woman, background, and we see the family in the back, child on the bed, to a shadow of a young boy in the back, curtains. And so we begin to see how families are central in the ways that living spaces are used and occupied, and Gordon is able to document it. There's a young woman here with high heel shoes, and we know this is probably for this image, with this sense. And this image here of the managers of the Yellowknife Hotel in Northwest Canada, 1945, and he photographed for the Standard Oil Company. Rooms $3 and up. And as other images, if I didn't point out in other images, calendars are part of the framing that's on the wall, but also the way that he is able to allow people to feel at ease, offer them a sense of their own humanity in creating these stories. And there's a sense of humor when looking at this image, $3 and up for rooms. Sugar Ray Robinson on the golf course. And again, families, a young girl reading a magazine with her dad, just an afternoon, and just a wonderful way of play and affection. And Gordon is experiencing that with photographing on the streets there, photographing Muhammad Ali in London in 1966, to the Browns in Somerville, Maine, evening where the dad is playing the accordion. And here we see newspapers, we see the curtains, and again, the mirror. And I'm going to end with this last image here of Harlem and the experience of how Gordon is looking inside, looking outside within the inside of a community, but also outside of a window, high rise, children playing and recreation in 1948 in Harlem. And so I just wanted to end there and just kind of offer an opportunity to think about how Gordon has been transformative as a photographer, transformed the idea of family, encouraging the creativity of looking at the creativity of housewives, of the way that they created their homes to make them habitable for a range of people who lived there, but also Gordon, who celebrates it in sense in that way. So thank you.
Eileen, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Professor Willis. That was chock full of material and insight. It's it's amazing. I was actually, well, I don't see any questions yet, but I did have a question, with your looking at all these different photographs of homes that Gordon Parks did throughout his career. Did you see any change in perception or perspective, as his own experiences in life changed? Can you, any thoughts on that?
Yes, just in terms of the way that Gordon spent a lifetime of documenting injustices, in terms of how he used the camera to ask questions about segregated signs and that experience. Having that opportunity, Gordon also opened up another kind of visual language for Americans and others who read Life magazine and Vogue to experience. But he was immersive in terms of, he was immersed in that communities that he traveled from, if it was Mobile, Alabama, or to Chicago, but he really believed in humanity. And as a result of that, having the opportunity to write, almost 5, 6 memoirs, where he expanded the stories that he initially talked about when he was maturing as a writer. Also the experience of the intellect of asking the choice of weapons when he created that book, where he decided, will I, pick up a gun or a camera? How can I make a difference? If I have a camera, I can make a difference. I could tell the story. But he also looked for joy, through the battles of poverty. He was also looking for joy and beauty. And that's something that I found really important in looking at his work.
We have a few comments here and questions. There's one from my colleague in the Gordon Parks project team from the English department, Katie Carlin, and she said, "Thank you so much for this talk. Looking at these living spaces gives me new insight to my favorite scene from Shaft, when Shaft and Ben escape crossfire in a Harlem tenement by ducking into the peaceful apartment of an old lady. The mise-en-scène was very similar to some of these apartments, and curtains were very prominent, as was a sewing kit." And
That's
actually,
great.
I
That's a
wanted
great
to,
observation for that, because when we think about Gordon's, in terms of creating the stock rooms in terms of the ideal rooms in movies like Shaft, he's been in those places, and understood what it meant to create a space that was safe for families, and having curtains in these spaces were important. But also it really showed the artistry of women in terms of decorating spaces. You know, there are images that I'm going to share the screen just for a second to show this image, where we think of this image here of this family in Mobile, Alabama. And again, how do we think about this? This is a family in a segregated town in Mobile, Alabama, where we see a charcoal drawing of a couple. This is an elderly couple sitting on the sofa with a burgundy sofa, flowers, but on the coffee table of Mr. and Mrs. Thornton in 1956, we see family photographs. We see family photographs on the glass table. We see as they probably sit there and look and tell stories about their experiences. So Gordon is constantly thinking about the aspect of how do we, deal with a segregated South, where a woman who cannot take her child or grandchild or niece or nephew into a shop to buy a school outfit, she has to look in the window and find ways to remember to make the dress so that her young child has the opportunity to wear a decent dress for school, like Bessie Fontanelle, who ironed that dress so that was a sense of armor, so she could prepare her child to go to school.
yes, thank you for that insight, about that photograph and the significance of that, pretty ironed dress hanging amid chaos in the house. And we have audience members here who also pointed out how that's such a stunning insight. And somebody else said that, you're pointing out the calendars on the walls in a lot of these images of homes, how significant that was. That was such an insight too. And I'll just say, everyone, that we may not be able to get to tell Professor Willis all your comments and questions, but she will get a transcript. So she'll see everybody's comments, even though we may not be able to say it here in the session. Someone asked that you made, the project that Gordon Parks did, of photographing homes sound so smooth, but were there a whole range of challenges that he had to surmount to create these images? What do you know about that?
Yeah, he did. I mean, just think of the Fontanelles. The last interview I had with Gordon 6 months before he died, he questioned that, because the Fontanelles, he raised money like he did for Flavio in Brazil, so that they could have an opportunity to live a better life. And they moved to Queens, and unfortunately, there was a house fire, and there was a death as a result of the house fire and in the family. And there was also injury because of the fire. And he felt that if he had not intervened, what would have happened? And so there's that question that always happens when a photographer who is interested in making a difference and transforming someone's life, having the opportunity to raise money to make a difference, and then a tragedy happens, and he felt horrible about it most of his life. So why I think what does home look like. He lost his mother as a teenager. He was kicked out of his sister's home by his brother-in-law at 16. And because of that, home was important for Gordon. He created a home for his family in Chicago. He created a home for his family in St. Paul, wherever they lived and throughout his lifetime.
And what really struck me looking at his photographs was the effort he made really to get to know the families and the people that he was photographing. So, always, like you said before, spending a week with the Fontenelle family without taking a photograph. It was after a week that he brought his camera. He never forgot their humanity. And I think in a lot of the images, as you said, with that iron dress amidst the chaos of a house, he's always looking for those moments of an effort to keep human dignity, despite hardships and despite chaos. I see that in a lot of his photographs. And I think like with even Harlem gang leader, with Red Jackson, it's supposed to be a story about gangs in Harlem, but a lot of the images show, family and inside the home and his place in that, which, kind of was counter to the stereotype. So he was really countering that example. And I think he had a bit of a conflict with the Life magazine editors too about that, because they wanted to emphasize kind of all the street fighting and, Red Jackson holding a gun when it's really like one moment out of so many.
Right. Yeah. And he writes about that he really wanted to tell the story of the cause of crime, the cause of poverty. And he was innovative in that way as a photographer.
Yeah. There's a question here asking if you could give some insight on Gordon Parks's photographic technique in
I
terms.
can't do that.
No, okay. He was asking when did he use large format? When did he use 35 mm?
Yeah, he used it all. With fashion photography, he used the 35. He used a Leica. He also used medium format camera. So, but I think it was all for whatever assignments he had or whatever choices he made during that time. But I don't know when and why he did that. But I think,
do you know by chance from working with him that would he bring multiple cameras?
Yes, he did. And that's why you see those 3 bags as he's walking out of the Harlem Y. I mean, he was always with equipment.
That's right. Well, I think that we might have to end.
Thank you.
There's so much to talk about. And there's so many comments. A lot of people talking about or thanking you for showing how Gordon Parks was a humanizing photographer and being sensitive to the humanity of his subjects always.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to reading your book.
Thank you. I can't wait for you to give me some feedback.
Okay. Well, have a good day.
Have a good evening, everyone, and thank you. We're getting a lot of thank yous, Professor Willis.
Oh, to everybody, thank you for
your presentation. Thank you very much. So we'll end the program here. You're welcome to log off. Maybe Professor Willis and I will stay a couple of more minutes to see if there are any other questions that come up in the chat, but you are free to log off if you have to go. Thank you, everyone. Oh, I don't even know where to begin. There's so many comments. We'll just have to give you the transcript of the chat.
Okay. That's
Yeah.
great. Okay.
Someone actually said that thank you for showing the range of Gordon Parks's work that show a range of imagery for what Black family looks like to counter the single story of what a Black family should look like.
Wow, that's really great. Yeah, I really spent time with trying to create a PowerPoint that had multiple stories about Gordon. And as we know, there's always that single narrative when describing Gordon's work, and Gordon photographed a range of people during his lifetime. But I think the kitchen table, when I think of Carrie Mae Weems and her kitchen table series, and it has a lot to do with what happens at that kitchen table. It's from homework to sharing stories to crying to therapy sessions to fulfilled meals during that time. So that's about it.
Actually, there was somebody earlier who was asking if it's a fair attribution to say that Carrie Mae Weems is following Gordon's footsteps.
Yes, with social justice and the other work that Carrie is creating. Yes, I would say that. Mm-hmm.
And I actually thought it was so insightful that you pointed out how mirrors showed up a lot in his images.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you could elaborate more on how he framed mirrors, or what did mirrors signify for him, or he wanted to make signify.
I don't know. I just found it just fascinating that it has a lot to do with reflecting space.
Mm-hmm.
People had small apartments. Mirrors also kind of reimagine space in terms of giving a dimension that many people don't have in small spaces, but also that he was able to, people had round mirrors, square mirrors, and the way that Gordon noticed them and the arrangement of them, I think, was really an important thing to recognize, and seeing that in the work.
Yeah, I didn't think of that the mirrors were used to make a space look bigger. Mm-hmm. Because they were limited in their space.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.